The last day of the inaugural Shakespeare Beyond Borders Alliance online conference. Welcome back. You're in for a packed program this afternoon. Do stay around. Leave your computer running, even if you're actually cooking lunch or doing any of the other healthy and useful and normal things you may be doing this afternoon, it being Friday. Good. Chris, Rowan and I absolutely delighted to welcome you back. This afternoon, in a very short time, we'll be handing over to session one, curating Shakespeare, the museum industry, the tourism industry and Shakespeare, where that is now, what it can do, and how it is transforming itself in the strange world in which we now find ourselves. Then at 1:05, after a break, I'll be talking with Ewan Fernie about the very remarkable Everything to Everybody project, by which Ewan and Shakespeare are both becoming all things to all men and women and members of other species in Birmingham and beyond, as he shares the cultural legacy of the People's Shakespeare Library, the Birmingham Shakespeare Library. There's no Shakespeare collection like it in public hands anywhere in the world, and reviving that 19th century utopianism that it embodies. We then will have another break, another highlight for all tea lovers, and then it's the Digital Shakespeare panel, as we talk about how globalization looks when everything is on Zoom, and how performance looks when liveness comes with a mute button. And then the final session will be our roundtable on the future of Shakespeare in print and online, where Shakespeare's text is now, whether it's in real space, virtual space, whether it was always in virtual space. And then at the end of the afternoon at 3:35, we'll be summing up the questions that you will have brought to this conference, the things you'll have been typing into the chat, and considering and explaining where we're going to go next. The first answer to which is, of course, Cyprus, the moment we can. It's now 12:02. I'm going to hand briefly over to Chris before the curation gets going.
Thank you so much. We'll get those tickets to Cyprus booked. That'll be lots of fun. So yeah, I think what I'd like to do is just go through some of my reflections again on the first day, or rather on the second day. And I'm still loving all of the international involvement in this event from both speakers and attendees. The focus on crossing social borders yesterday I found particularly affecting, and hearing all the amazing work done in Applied Shakespeare in Rowan's panel, and the work going on in amateur theatre companies in Michael's panel, as ways of reaching new and broader communities. I found that totally inspiring. And it just said so much about what we are trying to do here. These panels picked up on a thread which I think is key throughout this whole event, that of how we tell stories about ourselves through Shakespeare and what those stories mean, and just as importantly, who is writing or telling them. How do we each take ownership of our own stories, I think, is a thread that's also emerging. Sue Jennings' phrase, "What is theatre but stories in action," still resonates with me from yesterday. And speaking of resonating, I was just so captivated by the Equality Shakespeare panel, and it was such an honor to be part of that. The comments and responses by the panelists were so thoughtful, insightful, and I found quite deep in many ways. And I encountered concepts that I hadn't quite thought of in the same way before. And I've always thought of myself as an interdisciplinary scholar, but I've never thought of the significance of the kind of quality of discomfort involved in bringing disciplines together, and how that same discomfort may, in a way, be a root cause of what makes it so worthwhile. And I think we underestimate the value of the lessons learnt through discomfort and suffering, because naturally we seek to avoid suffering and discomfort where we can. But the discussions demonstrated that sticking with and acknowledging that can really change our views in a quite positive way of what normality is. And it makes us question the very roots of what is normal, and how that construction of normality feeds prejudices of so many kinds. And it strikes me that this dissecting of what is normal goes at the heart of our attempts here to cross national and social as well as disciplinary borders. Also, as someone who's lived with and been a long-term carer for a family member classed as severely disabled, which again for me is kind of at the heart partly of everything I feel connects me to Beyond Borders, I was blown away and moved by the discussions around the idea of shifting our perspective slightly to look at the ways in which the spaces around us and the world we inhabit can create this disability that society ascribes to some individuals. That so strongly resonated with my own experiences. And also I have to mention another standout phrase of the day was by Wendy Lennon, among many standout revelations. And the quote is, Shakespeare should be used as a tool and not as a weapon in the classroom. I think that's a great quotation. Lastly, another takeaway for me was the Crossing Social Borders Roundtable. And I just found this idea of the intersectionality of the climate crisis with class and race was something that hadn't quite hit home to me in the same way before that discussion. And I think, you know, that was something I'm really going to take away from this moving forwards. And how amazing to hear about all the alternative spaces being used for theatre, which again challenge in the best ways possible our preconceptions of what theatre is and should be. And so I'm looking forward to another day of truly inspiring discussions, and thanks everybody again for continuing with us on this exciting and enlightening journey. Rowan.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Thanks, Michael. Yeah, yesterday for me was just phenomenal. I think it was wonderful. And I'm not going to go over, you know, Chris has mentioned a lot of the highlights. We could be here all day. I think there were highlights from every single person that spoke. I think for me, what was so special about the whole Shakespeare Beyond Borders Alliance is how actually that common thread of humanity comes through. And I think there were so many times when we were talking about our need as humans to tell our story and to tell stories, and how actually our identity is embedded within those stories that we talk about. I think that's really important. And I think that came across from such a diverse range of academics, practitioners, you know, people from the prison service, people who are working with disadvantaged youth, etc., etc. And it was just so great to have such a diverse range of voices, but actually to hear that commonality. And I think it's exactly what we hoped that Shakespeare Beyond Borders would allow us to do, was to bring those voices together so that we can start to talk about the collaborations, we can start to talk about actually how do we progress this, because this very much is, you know, the first event of what I'm hoping and fairly confident now is going to be a really fruitful and engaging movement of people who want to engage with Shakespeare and use Shakespeare and play with Shakespeare to make the world a better and more equitable place for all of us to exist in. And I think for me that's really important. Too many things to talk about that I enjoyed yesterday, but again, I think it's also been great in terms of the amount of comments and sharing that have happened in terms of the chat and the Q&A, and I'd encourage you to carry on with that. Twitter, I think my phone got to the point yesterday it was about to blow up, so much so that we now have our own Twitter handle. So it was detailed on your link that was emailed out this morning, but it's at Borders Alliance. Chris did point out that sounded like we were going to be the border police. I don't know whether we're going to beat the borders down with copies of Richard III or something, but I mean, I'm up for that if other people are as well. But obviously, please do follow us on Twitter. Make sure that you keep tweeting about today. We literally had hundreds and hundreds of people sharing yesterday, and it's great because we don't want this to be exclusive. That's the whole point. We want it out there in the wider world. And even this morning, I'd had people email me going, actually, I haven't been to the other 2 days. Can I come along to today? Yes, of course you can. Let's get more people involved. Keep sharing. Keep telling us what works. Keep telling us the ideas that you've got. And I think that's the great thing. You know, we've got, 600 and something people engaged across these 3 days. And we've got some of the people who are the most passionate about Shakespeare, most passionate about people, and that's great. So absolutely valid point, Lindy. I appreciate not everyone is on Twitter, and we will, I'm hoping, be having a website set up at some point as well. I was proud that I managed to set up a Twitter page. I didn't manage to do a website overnight as well. That one's beyond my capabilities, so we'll definitely be going to the professionals for that one.
It's coming,
but I'm really
coming.
As long as I'm not designing it, that's okay. Really conscious of time, and I know, Chris, you've got a great panel to look forward to in terms of curating Shakespeare and how that's going to move forward. So I'm going to say thank you very much and disappear and allow you to invite your panelists forward.
Thank you so much indeed, Michael and Rowan. Thank you for your wonderful comments. And thank you everybody for joining us. Yeah, so I invite our panelists, Paul Edmondson, Nicola Watson and Guy Young, to please reveal yourselves and join us.
We shall draw the veil and show you the picture.
And what a beautiful picture it is. I'm so grateful to you all for joining us. Thank you very much indeed. And I'm so looking forward to our discussion, exploring how we tell Shakespeare's life story through curating and tour guiding, and how this might help us reach wider audiences. And I'm so pleased to be joined today by Dr. Paul Edmondson, Head of Research and Knowledge at the Shakespeare Institute, Professor Nicola Watson, Professor of English Literature at the Open University, and Guy Young, a prize-winning London guide who's led Shakespeare Walks. He's also a doctoral candidate at the Shakespeare Institute and one of my supervisees along with Paul. We're both supervising together. And I believe Michael is also a supervisor of Guy's work. And he's one of the few recipients of the highly competitive full doctoral funding awards from Midlands Four Cities Consortium for his research into the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust and the history of Shakespeare curating and life writing. And to preserve time for our discussions, I'll refer you to their very full and rich biographies, which are attached to our programme guide on the Shakespeare Beyond Borders Alliance events page, and to the online web pages of the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust, Open University and Shakespeare Institute. Instead, I'll invite them to kind of begin just to introduce themselves. So could we start? Do please tell us what your field of interest is and why you feel curating or tour guiding Shakespeare is important. Why is it meaningful to you? Why are you passionate about it? So let's just go around in alphabetical order. Let's go to you first, Paul.
Thank you, Chris. What a great few days this has been. What a great and expanding conversation Beyond Borders has demonstrated. And your question for me, I cannot separate an interest in Shakespeare from how we tell Shakespeare's story. I can't do that. So my answer to your first question is because I hope and I believe that Shakespeare makes us more generous-minded, that Shakespeare makes us think better and might make us more tolerant and kinder as people. So anything that can tell the story of the person who created those works, and indeed the story of those works themselves, which is the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust's continued endeavour, has my vote and my commitment and my career. So that's my initial reaction to your question. Shakespeare is an enormous conversation, like Beyond Borders, and the Birthplace Trust and what we do there with our curating is a way of involving more people in that expanding conversation.
Fantastic. Yeah, Shakespeare is beyond borders, in its deepest essence. Absolutely. Thank you. Nicola.
I'm not sure that's alphabetical, but I will allow myself to jump in as a W, if you like. It's great to be here. It's a wonderful event to be part of. I'm here really because for the last 20 years or so, I've been working on literary tourism, the history and practice of it, and as part of that, the business of literary placemaking, which includes the Writers' House Museum. And I'll stick a few links to what I've been doing into the chat box in a moment. My most recent effort has been to construct a network of mostly literary museums across Europe to create a virtual museum of romanticism. But even there, Shakespeare sneaks in because in many ways, the sort of Shakespeare that we're talking about, the sort of Shakespeare that is curated and in place, was invented in the Romantic period, which is my hometown, as it were. So I'll also stick something in there. And I suppose my answer to your question is really epitomized by my reaction or my interest in the new statue outside the birthplace, which I've been writing about recently, so I'm interested in where we were, which was roughly the birthplace as origin for national genius. So that was the story about Shakespeare that started up somewhere in the 1780s, perhaps, in any real powerful way. And this new story that statue is telling, which is, first of all, reinvent Shakespeare as Miranda, and thus institutes conversation with global tourists walking down Henley Street as it announces Brave New World that has such people in it. So there's to pick up that important word, conversation, and create Stratford, therefore, as glocal, horrid word, useful idea. But also the way that the birthplace is now starting to convene people who are interested in imagination and fantasy and creativity. And I think that in large part is what I'm interested in around the stories around Shakespeare. And we can talk a little bit more about that, but I'm on the side at the moment of imagination, fantasy and creativity.
Fabulous. Yeah, you can see those legacies from the Romantic period, can't you, right there? We're still engaged in the imaginative reinvention of Shakespeare every generation. That's a very kind of romantic ideal. Thank you so much. Guy.
Well, thank you very much for having me here. My name is Guy Young. I'm a Midlands 4 Cities funded PhD student at the Institute and working in collaboration with the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust. I'm studying how Shakespeare's life has been presented in and through Stratford spaces and places through curation, guiding, and placemaking. And I'm focusing on 3 snapshots in time: 1910, 1951, and 2016. I've always been passionate about literary geography, by which I mean the places imagined or lived in by authors. When I began teaching secondary English 20 odd years ago in London, I was desperate to break down the classroom walls and to use the built environment on my doorstep to bring Shakespeare's and other writers' works alive, reinvesting students in the built environment and the wonder of London at the time. So I studied to become a City of London guide and was fortunate to win the Katrine Prince Memorial Prize. Katrine Prince was one of the people who helped to set up important standards of guiding adopted by the Institute of Tour Guiding. I wear my City of London guiding badge with pride today. My plans to set up an educational tour guiding initiative coincided, alas, with the crash of 2009, and work and caregiving for my son drew me away from London. My PhD is reigniting my passion for literary places, and especially those associated with Shakespeare in Stratford and Warwickshire.
Thank you so much. Yeah, that sort of gets to the heart of the importance of the sense of place. I think we're going to be kind of engaging with in this discussion and what that actually means. And I guess in relation to this, I wanted to pick up a bit on what you've mentioned, a couple of you already, about the kind of stories we tell about Shakespeare. And I was just wondering what you felt about what kinds of stories we should be telling. Are there any particular elements of Shakespeare's life or work that we should be emphasizing in these stories? And how do those stories that we tell help us reach people across social strata, across differing backgrounds and nationalities, for instance? But let's go around again in the same order. Paul.
Thank you, Chris. I mean, in some ways, the Birthplace Trust has, as it were, built up over 150 years more. an inevitable almost portfolio of, as it were, material culture. And I'm thinking, of course, especially of the five houses, as it were, the rooted wattle and daub, as well as bricks and mortar, that help us tell a given story of those places rooted in Stratford-upon-Avon, in Warwickshire, of those places rooted in Shakespeare's domestic and family life. So in a way, they are all of them three-dimensional opportunities to tell Shakespeare's story. You walk into the birthplace, or Anne Hathaway's cottage, or Hall's Croft, or Mary Arden's house, or New Place, the site of, and you're sort of walking into, you become a sort of walking biographer or biography into a biography of Shakespeare, which, you know, impresses upon us differently each time we go into them, something about him as a person and about his works. But that's only one part of the elements that the Birthplace Trust has as an opportunity. There, of course, are the collections, the library, archive and museum collections, which help us to illustrate as well as literally furnish and set, because they are like a stage set, of course. The set designs we choose are the stories we're choosing to tell at the moment within the Shakespeare houses. Elements of Shakespeare's influence in the world and the world in which he lived. And within the collection, of course, are international expressions. So it's partly about Shakespeare in the world, as well as the afterlife of the plays through different artistic endeavour and illustration and objects and so on. The other part of our story is Stratford's story, and this is about our rootedness from the 12th century onwards, which our archives demonstrate. So we like to say that we can illustrate Stratford 400 years before Shakespeare and 400 years after Shakespeare. And we are obviously a long established, enduring expression of Shakespeare in the world. And our ongoing interest is how we reinvent that story. And if so, why? What are the points of reinvention? Nikki mentioned one of them a moment ago. Shakespeare is identified with Miranda not by the way he's appearing in the new statue, but by the quotation from Miranda around the base of the statue, and that sense of, you know, artistic license and new creativity, which the Birthplace Trust is engaging with, is an important part, I think, of our ongoing curation. I'll stop there for a moment.
That's fantastic. It's fabulous, and I love the role of creativity in that. You know, it's what comes across beautifully in what you're saying is that, you know, we are not these passive receptacles of Shakespeare. We interact creatively through the ages with Shakespeare, and we all do that on our own kind of level when we're encountering Shakespeare. I love that idea of the kind of expressions of Shakespeare and the different national expressions that exist in that creative medium. Thank you so much. Nicola.
Yes, let me pick up a bit from what Paul was saying. I think what's so interesting, and this works for many authors, but perhaps particularly for Shakespeare, that there's a problem with telling location-specific stories about any literary figure. It's the disparity between the place that originated the writer, whether you think this is the house they were born in, or the desk at which they wrote, or the skull in which they thought, or, you know, whatever story you tell about that. There's a disparity between that and the place that originates the author, as it were, which is, and the place of the origination of the author is the act of reading a book, usually, or seeing a performance by unnumbered readers and audiences across the centuries and continents. So there's always this tension around literary houses. But that said, I have this feeling that Shakespeare is uniquely capable, actually, of mediating that sentiment, the sentiment that's generated by that disparity between the sort of materiality and historicity on the one hand of place, and the powerful abstraction of a global reputation. And I think that one can harness that power of that disparity to convene new imagined communities in that way. And I think, to pick up what you were saying, Chris, as well, and related to that story of new imagined communities, there's a more nebulous story about the power of imagination, the power of performance, the power of empathy to dissolve borders. So I'm sure you'll see where I'm going with this, Paul having kindly explained that Shakespeare wasn't actually dressed as Miranda. But my sense in that statue, but my sense is that for the immediate future, there is likely to be a privileging of the Tempest as a sort of palette of colours and tones. As I've written elsewhere, you know, it already informs the story told in the garden at New Place, although I think it's yet to come fully into its own there. But if we do want to talk about the imagining of a new and better cross-border society out of the old and corrupt, the Tempest could set the terms for such a discussion, even though, of course, its answers are always ambiguous.
Thank you so much. I love this idea of imagined communities and communities of the imagination, in a sense, and what that might mean and how we might interpret or reinterpret Shakespeare's output in relation to that. And of course, there is something interesting about the shift from the romantic concept of the imagination to where we are now. I mean, with the romantics, obviously, there was always, and I think it goes back to what you're saying about the ambiguities, there's always something dark about the imagination too. There's a complexity of emotion, isn't there? You know, fear, the uncertainty of the unknown. And I think those are elements that are integral, I think, also to our kind of honest engagement with those realms of the imagination. I think that's really kind of a very compelling idea. Thank you. Guy?
I think that for a long time, there's been a desire to write the great cradle to grave biography of Shakespeare. And my feeling is that this has ruptured our sense of the places and spaces in Shakespeare's life, because those have been dished up to serve a narrative that's linear and complete. So that you have, for example, the role in his life that London and Stratford have become sort of separated. In this sort of Bildungsroman account, Shakespeare makes it in the Big Smoke. He lives estranged from his family, and he retires to Stratford. And I see that again and again in accounts of Shakespeare's life as I look through biographies from the past. But a different picture, thanks to Dr. Edmondson's work on New Place, is taking hold. One much more sympathetic to the idea that, as Sir Stanley Wells put it, Shakespeare was a commuter writer, shuttling between Stratford and London. And I think this is so important because, for me, the idea that Shakespeare was always mentally and imaginatively in two different places in his mind simultaneously, thinking about Stratford when he was in London and vice versa, explains so much about his art. I'm sorry if I start to gush a little. You can always mute me if necessary, but thinking about his father as a glove maker, and thinking about how Shakespeare, knowing that particular art and craft, and the weird chiral similarity between, but asymmetry between left and right hand. He knew that all inside out. And I think that really appealed to his inventiveness. And I think that he needed a London as a left hand as much as he needed Stratford as a right hand, not simply a country city thing, but something more elegantly twisted together. And I think that shows in his plays and in his poetry. I'm sure that many people have said that much more eloquently. But for me, London isn't just a much bigger version of Stratford, and a Thames isn't just a much bigger version of the Avon. So going back to your question, I think a really important story to tell is that of Shakespeare's experience coming from two spaces intertwining, that when I picture him at New Place, perhaps on his deathbed, hearing the chimes, not the chimes, but the tolling of the bell at the chapel, there are two rivers of experience running through his mind, a sort of intercoiling of the Avon and the Thames, the pictures in his mind like a sort of Finnegan's Wake of his life. That moment of his biography in a sort of modernist sense gives us what Shakespeare was. He wasn't divided between two spaces. He was present in both wherever he was embodied. And that's long and rambling, but I don't think that Shakespeare cut himself off from Stratford at all. And a person doesn't shuttle like a yo-yo in this way between two places without a big supportive network of people who support him at both poles of his travels. And I think these people also deserve their place in the Shakespeare story. And I think that's part of what has been going on with the Shakespeare Circle, a recent biography of Shakespeare too. So I think there's always more to say about Shakespeare, but this idea of his doubleness, his plurality, the asymmetries of his life, the poles of his life, I think Stratford is a wonderful place to interrogate the arts alongside, in parallel with the biography, the life.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I love this idea of being elegantly twisted. And there's something very Wordsworthian about that image of Shakespeare's mind being formed by the sounds of the river. That's, you know, it takes us right back to Wordsworth's great kind of epic poem, The Prelude. And
I can't help myself, Chris, I'm sorry.
No, it's fantastic. I love it. And I love this idea of the disjointedness of the connection between creativity and place as a challenge to kind of concepts of linearity. I think that's absolutely fantastic. I'd like to kind of ask each of you a more specific question, if I may. I'd like to begin with Paul, if that's okay. And I'd just like to ask you a bit more about what you see as the Birthplace Trust's role in mediating the public's understanding of Shakespeare's life and why the houses are important. But also, what would you say are the SBT's values today?
Thank you, Chris. I'll take the last point first and say that, you know, when we are asked about values, we really always have to come back to our trust deed and what we're supposed to be doing as a charitable organisation. And the first point of the trust deed is to say that we're promoting knowledge and appreciation of Shakespeare's plays and other works throughout the world. So that's an international remit, and you don't need a specific place in order to do that from. The second point is to make available as national memorials the 5 Shakespeare houses that I mentioned before as a living memorial to William Shakespeare. And the third is to make available a library, archive and museum collection with specific reference to Shakespeare and Stratford-upon-Avon. So all those 3 things we do, and the houses unashamedly play a really important part in that, because we need the income from tourist economies in order to fund the charitable work we do with not only looking after the houses themselves and conserving them, which is very costly, and running them, and the gardens, but also the educational remit to hundreds of thousands of school children and college students annually, from primary schools up and down the land in Shakespeare Week through to university courses and members of the public who come to us for learning experiences, and to keep available the archive and the library available free of charge for anyone who wants to consult the material, to extend knowledge, to deepen their appreciation. So that's what we do, and it's what we stand for. In terms of the houses and how we curate them, so to go to your first question, it's important to us, I think, that the houses themselves being rooted in the locale, become focal points for Shakespeare's humanity and the ordinariness of his family life and the culture of his time, which picks up on what Guy was saying a moment ago about how, you know, we have civic London capital city rooted Shakespeare with his professional life, and we have this rural market town Shakespeare where he put down his investments mainly, as well as some of in the theatre in London, but significant amounts of land he's investing in from 1602 in Stratford-upon-Avon, and of course New Place itself from 1597 was a very important place to him. And so all of this helps to answer the sorts of or is an expression of the tension that Nikki mentioned with the romantic Shakespeare, that the love of this author starts through reading or seeing the plays, and it's, well, then how, I suppose it's, how do you share that love? And one way of sharing that is through these real places which become touchstones for the imagination, and therefore the curating of those spaces enable us to tell stories which will deepen people's appreciation and sense of closeness to Shakespeare. And within that, of course, we've got, you know, as it were, material remains, so that sense of touching something or being somewhere that the author was there before you it is very real. And this is the case, of course, in many other writers' houses. But Shakespeare seems to have been there. Well, he has been there the longest, I suppose, or one of the longest, certainly in the UK, and that sense of pilgrimage to watch relics, to some kind of sanctuary. I mean, these are metaphors which may or may not be helpful, but that one quickly starts using them in order to try and explain or start to analyze what's going on with Shakespeare as such a focal point through these houses. The other thing the houses allow us to do, because of, as it were, disseminating story through major focal points, is to act as a broker of other people's stories, by which I mean, for example, university projects might get turned into curatorial aspects in the houses. And a recent example of this, which I was much involved with, two examples. We'll talk about New Place later on. Guy's already mentioned it, but he's also mentioned the Shakespeare Circle, which is a collection of essays for Cambridge University Press from 2015 that I co-edited with Stanley Wells. And they are essays about the people in Shakespeare's life we know he was closest to, both in Stratford and London. And one of the things that we did was to produce imagined monologues of those people speaking based on the research in the essays in the book for a wider public. So the Birthplace Trust is always, as it were, a broker. It's a bridge organisation from, you know, research and the academic and the scholarly side of things through to a general public who perhaps otherwise wouldn't easily be able to access the thinking, the generation of new knowledge which is taking place in academia around Shakespeare. The sorts of conversations we've heard about in Beyond Borders, about Shakespeare and climate emergency, about Shakespeare and sexualities, that those sorts of conversations can be made available to a wider public through the way we curate the houses in Stratford, should we choose to.
Absolutely, and you know, the SBT becoming a kind of repository for those stories, I think, is an important idea. Thank you very much. And there are elements there that are a lovely segue into the question I have for Nicola. In your recent wonderful book on the author's effects, you talk about so eloquently and vividly about writers' houses, and I was just wondering if you felt there was anything unique in terms of Shakespeare in relation to the kinds of historical trends used to kind of describe or to encompass or to understand writers' houses, or the curating of writers' houses. Is there something unique about Shakespeare, in your opinion, or does it follow other trends that you've seen with other writers?
Well, I suppose my view is that it's both. I mean, he's both unique and absolutely conventional. he becomes so important during the 18th century that come the 1780s, it becomes necessary to fabricate enough materiality to ground him as an author in a life and a location. And by the mid-19th century, of course, the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust is actually formed in order to formalize that, as it were. But what it means is that the business of collecting and curating Shakespeare is absolutely fascinating, because it describes what people felt at any one time was necessary to materialize an author, especially a national author as important as Shakespeare. And if it wasn't extant, it was quite often brought into being, we might say. So one of the examples of that would be the locks of Shakespeare's hair that appear in the early 19th century, are apparently gifted to the poet laureate, appropriately enough, and are currently held in the SBT's collections. So unique on the one hand, uniquely important, absolutely conventional in others.
And this kind of, it reminds me of what you write in your book so brilliantly about Shakespeare's chair. I mean, who knew Shakespeare's chair would become such a kind of thing? You know, what do you think is at the heart of the obsession with Shakespeare's chair?
Well, I mean, my own view is, and as you know, I organized that book around iconic or even totemic objects associated with authors. They look different, and a totemic object changes over time, but they are must-haves of their period, and they reflect general widespread habits of memorializing the dead and dead authors at the time. But they're much more like each other than they look at first blush, because what they have in common is the work they're supposed to do for the modern reader. They're supposed to connect the modern reader to the author, and they do that by co-locating the imaginary body of the author with that of the reader at exactly the moment where authorship is in play, or even, as it were, coming into being. Which is why Shakespeare's ring is important, because it is a synecdoche for the writing hand and the signature for finishing something off. It's why the chair is important, because it's all about the duration of composition. And it's why death relics, such as death masks and so on, are important, because it very specifically marks the moment where power actually transfers, you might say, from the living writer to the living reader. And you know, I was thinking about this today and wondering what it was, therefore, what the modern version of this really was. You know, it's not that that there isn't a value to be put on Shakespeare's chair. I'm beginning to wonder what the most powerful way of co-locating living reader and pseudo-living author is, and I think it probably turns into the selfie. But I'd be really interested to know. But the thing about the selfie is that it does in fact superimpose you upon the materiality of the inherited place. So it'd be interesting to hear what other people have think about that.
Yeah, that is so fascinating. I mean, yeah, it kind of ties into another thread of this whole event, which is to do with embodiment and embodied experience and what that actually means. I think that's a really nice segue into my question for Guy, which is about this difference between tour guiding and curating kind of more fixed spaces. And is there something different about curating as about tour guiding rather, as opposed to curating? Is there something different about what it means to be mobile when experiencing places or locations associated with Shakespeare?
Well, at first sight, I think there are some strong resemblances between curating and guiding. For instance, both require selection. You can't show everything. You have to provide a frame and perhaps a line of narrative or a theme. Just as the museum's archive is a forest through which the visitor needs a path, the street in a town is made up of a mass of details, and like a curator, the guide needs to pick out those things that can best tell the story. So there's a lot of searching out and researching in advance to make sure you've found those nodal points along the way. But there's a major difference here because of the interpersonal mode. I think having a person there, that person can help to conjure up the imagination. I think that a guide has to be alert to the audience, answer questions, seize on serendipitous opportunities. And you never know who you're going to get, who's going to assemble for a walk, or what's going to happen on the walk. So I think there's a real sense of shared open experience and shared attunement to the surroundings as well. And I think that makes it perhaps more possible than in a museum environment for there to be moments of sensing one's orientation, having a sense of belonging, perhaps even finding little pockets of reverie where you have these rich shared conversations about what you're imagining there taking place, or perhaps overturning some ideas that people have had before, because they realize in a moment with somebody else that it doesn't quite work that way. So I think a good guide needs to be a bit of a poet and a bit of a conjurer, bit of a performer, and to have lots of passion. But it all needs to be rooted in a solid foundation of interpretation as well. And I think that in a museum setting with curation, there are many possibilities, of course. But in some museums I've been to have approached the telling of that story in a very linear way, and you have to move in a certain way from room to room. This is not the case with the SBT. I think one of the joys of the SBT is that you buy your little packet of tickets and you can go freely with your own received ideas about Shakespeare and move in a non-linear way between the different environments, the different gardens, the different houses, and guide yourself. And the curator isn't directing the footfall in quite the same way. And I think along those passages between the different places, guidebooks or guides are really important because they nudge people in the right direction. And I think there's a long history at the SBT of, within the curated environment, there also being guides on hand, or the secretaries of the birthplace on hand as caretakers to help facilitate these imaginings.
Absolutely. I think you're making a very important point now about the intersections between tour guiding and the more fixed spaces of curation, which is a really important point. We've got about 4 minutes left, and I did just want, in the last 4 minutes, to ask you all if you could speak for a minute or so each about where you think curating is going and how it might be changing in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Will that have a lasting effect? Will that change the kinds of technologies we're using in curating and tour guiding? What kind of lasting effect might that have? If I can come to you first, Paul.
Thank you. I'll be brief, as many people say in Shakespeare and then are not. 40 lines follow. So we've already seen an effect, haven't we? Because the birthplace is reopened on the 17th of May, and Hathaway's a new place reopened on the 14th of June. Social distancing, little videos by the great Michael Wood, Shakespeare a historian, television historian, that people can download through QR codes onto their phones, as well as have guides speaking in the house, is very important. Just endorsing what Guy said a moment ago, guiding in that sense is theatre, and there's you'll never get a sense of humour from a QR code. You will from a real guide and a person. Very important to keep the thing alive. Another thing that I think lockdown has certainly done for me is it's turned me back to the words and the reading and the quietness and the solitariness. And I think my version of the selfie, Nikki, and I'm going to hand on to you after this, is one's own personal Shakespeare anthology that one writes. The Tempest has been mentioned this morning. I predict that as it were, a child said to me recently, queuing up to go into the birthplace, I hope I see his quill and his parchment. And I thought, you're not going to see them, but I'd love you to. And basically she wanted to write. And I think that sense of collecting Shakespeare through our own handwriting in a beautiful notebook is for me perhaps something that we produce as visitors going forwards.
Thank you so much. It perfectly encapsulates something you said earlier. A question you asked earlier is, how do we share the love? And it's that humanity. I think that's really important. Thank you. Nicola.
Well, I'll just pick out one thing of all the many things that one might talk about, I suppose, including my desire to be back in New Place. I think what COVID did was prove that there was a huge appetite for virtual tours and virtual exhibitions. They're not the same, of course, as being there in person, but a lot of people can't be there. And so I think that the huge opportunity that is offering at the moment is to combine the live with this dispersed virtual audience, and to allow all sorts of things that for physical logistic reasons haven't been possible. For example, picking out the SBT collections and the RSC collections from the vaults and making them available to people around the world. I think that's what's so exciting. And I think that it's one of the remarkable things that come out of COVID, that museum culture is very invested in place and object. It's auratic and haptic quality, rightly so. But there is still a place for this other way of experiencing or finding it. And I think that particularly if it can be, a horrid word, monetized, that this is a wonderful possibility for going forward for Stratford.
Thank you so much. Wonderful. And Guy?
Yes, I think there are enormous possibilities out there with virtual reality and augmented reality. I know that the holy grail really in VR is cracking presence. How do you make somebody feel presence? Once that happens, I can envisage that there will be digital twins of all these buildings, and people wherever they are in the world will be able to walk the corridors, walk into the rooms and touch what's there. So the haptic will be there. What won't perhaps be there will be the sense of authenticity. And I think that if we can store and curate and collect and archive people's experiences, people's reveries, people's attachments, emotional attachments to little corners, little places, a nail in a floorboard or a view glimpsed through a window, and somehow collect and collate those, then those can be imported into a digital twin. And you can walk around and you can have all of that interpersonal, wondrous experience of conjecture and of imagination and reverie, because you'll be able to tap in and listen to what other people felt and experienced when they were there in the real place.
That's fabulous.
So,
I mean, it captures
just an idea.
Yeah, I think it's beautiful. I mean, it captures just perfectly that, you know, what we want moving into the future is to not forget the human aspect, the humanity, that idea of presence and being together. That's been emphasized in such an important way, you know, the materiality of experience. Thank you so much just for a fantastic discussion. It's just been so enlightening and so engaging. very positive in many ways about moving forward into the future. So I'm very grateful to you for joining me on this panel, and thank you so much, everybody, for watching. And there's lots more to come. Keep staying tuned into our forthcoming panels today. And thank you very much for continuing to share this experience with all of us. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you, Shakespeare Institute.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much indeed.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye. Bye.